The story of the VT fuse began not on a battlefield, but in quiet laboratories and workshops, where the war was fought with wires, solder, and equations instead of rifles. In 1940, as bombs rained over Britain and radar masts dotted its coasts, a delegation from London carried something just as precious as any weapon: a list of the nation's scientific secrets. The Tizard mission, named after Sir Henry Tizard, traveled across the Atlantic to share Britain's most advanced technologies with the United States. Among them was a small, obscure idea that had so far refused to work: a fuse that could sense its target and detonate automatically. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The concept was simple, in theory. Every anti-aircraft gun relied on timing. Crews would set mechanical fuses by hand, guessing when a shell would reach an enemy plane. If they misjudged by even a fraction of a second, the shell would burst harmlessly in empty sky. In 1939, British gunners were firing thousands of shells for every aircraft brought down. It was a game of mathematics and luck. The Americans, through the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, took the British problem and poured it into the hands of a handful of scientists working under absolute secrecy. Their new home? The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Their task? To build a fuse that did think. They called it the proximity fuse, later codenamed VT for variable time. But inside, it was a marvel of impossible engineering. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, and a circuit that could measure the change in radio waves as they bounced off a nearby object. When the reflected signal reached a certain threshold, the circuit triggered detonation, turning the air around a target into a lethal sphere of fragments. Making it work, however, was a nightmare. A fuse had to survive being fired from a gun at 20,000 times the force of gravity, an acceleration that could crush any delicate circuit. Glass tubes shattered, solder joints broke, and batteries failed under the stress. Each prototype was destroyed in milliseconds. The breakthroughs came one failure at a time. Engineers found a way to coat vacuum tubes with rubber shock mounts. Crosley Corporation, better known for making radios and refrigerators, began producing ruggedized miniature tubes by the thousands. The fuse could now operate in the cold, thin air of 30,000 feet and power itself with a tiny mercury battery. By 1942, test firings began over the Chesapeake Bay. Drones flew as targets. Gunners fired VT shells that exploded not on impact, but when they came close enough to trigger the fuse. Onlookers gasped as target aircraft disintegrated midair. The weapon worked. Yet its existence was now too precious to risk. The Allies feared that if even a single intact fuse fell into German hands, scientists at Peenemünde or Siemens could copy the design. So, strict orders followed. The VT fuse could only be used in naval guns where failed shells would fall into the sea. On land, it was forbidden. In 1943, the Navy armed its 5-inch dual-purpose guns in the Solomon Islands with VT fuses. The results were staggering. Japanese dive bombers shredded before reaching their targets, entire waves broken apart by invisible bursts. Admiral William Bull Halsey called it the most important new development in the Pacific War since radar. By late 1943, Army ordnance began planning land use. As invasion plans for Europe solidified, they saw a new threat rising: German missiles. If the Nazis began firing pilotless aircraft or rockets at England, the old-timed shells would never stop them. A defense that could think for itself, a shell that could sense, might be the only answer. The scientists of APL, Crosley, and the OSRD never saw the front lines, but in every test, every equation, they were preparing for a war that would soon arrive over the Channel, the war against the V-1 flying bomb. And when that moment came, the small glass tubes they built in secret would decide whether London burned again or survived. In the spring of 1944, as Allied troops prepared for D-Day, deep inside Germany a new kind of weapon was being assembled, one that required no pilot, no mercy, and no emotion. It was called Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon Number 1. To the world, it would be known as the V-1 flying bomb. The weapon looked crude, a stubby fuselage, short wings, and a pulsing jet engine mounted on its back that coughed and roared like a mechanical heartbeat. Yet this simplicity was deceptive. The V-1 was the world's first operational cruise missile, capable of flying nearly 150 miles at 400 miles per hour, carrying an 850-kilogram or 1,870-pound warhead. Its target was London. By June 1944, as the Allies broke through Normandy, Hitler's scientists and engineers prepared their counterattack. From launch ramps hidden in the forests of Pays de Calais, the first V-1s streaked toward the English coast. On June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, the first bomb roared over the Channel, its buzzing jet echoing through the night sky. Londoners soon gave it a name: Buzz Bomb. At first, the British had no effective defense. Radar could track the V-1s, but gunners couldn't calculate their speed accurately enough. The bombs came fast and low, often too fast for fighters to intercept and too erratic for timed fuses. Each explosion brought chaos. Homes flattened, buses shredded, entire blocks reduced to rubble. In the first week alone, 2,000 V-1s were launched. Hundreds hit London. Winston Churchill described the attacks as the New Blitz. He demanded an immediate answer. The British defenses, codenamed Operation Diver, were reorganized with urgency. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns were moved to the south coast, radar nets expanded, and fighter squadrons assigned exclusively to hunt the V-1s. But even with improvements, the kill rates were abysmal. For every bomb destroyed, several slipped through. The guns fired thousands of shells each night, but their time fuses simply couldn't match the V-1's speed and erratic altitude. British crews called the effort like trying to hit a fly with a shovel. In the United States, news of the attacks reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At the Applied Physics Laboratory and Army Ordnance Headquarters, scientists immediately recognized what this meant: the perfect opportunity and necessity for the VT fuse. The system they had guarded so carefully might now save London. However, there was hesitation. If a shell with a VT fuse landed unexploded on German soil, the enemy could recover it, dismantle it, and replicate its secrets. The British Air Ministry, desperate for results, agreed to use it only in anti-aircraft guns along the Channel coast where failures would land in the sea. By late June 1944, shipments of proximity-fused shells began arriving in England. The first to receive them were the gunners of the U.S. 1st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group and Britain's 40mm Bofors and 3.7-inch gun batteries positioned along the South Defense Line from Dover to Beachy Head. The arrival of the new shells felt almost mythical to the crews. Inside each casing, engineers had sealed radio components in wax and glass, each fuse a tiny machine brain. For most gunners, they might as well have been magic. They simply loaded them, fired, and watched what happened next. On July 16, 1944, the transformation began. The skies over the Channel filled with the droning of V-1s. Gunners adjusted their sights and waited for the buzzing missiles to cross into range. They fired not hundreds of shells, but dozens. Each one exploded not randomly, but precisely, within yards of the target. The air itself seemed to reach out and destroy the bombs. By midnight, 82% of all incoming V-1s had been destroyed, a kill rate so extraordinary that commanders doubted the reports. But radar logs confirmed it. Out of 104 V-1s that crossed into the defended zone, 85 were destroyed before reaching London. The secret of the VT fuse was no longer a laboratory triumph. It was a battlefield revolution. For the first time, Londoners could sleep without constant fear. The buzz of vengeance faded into silence, replaced by the steady rhythm of guns that could finally think for themselves. The German engineers who built the V-1 would never know exactly why their miracle weapon had failed so suddenly. They would blame poor aim, faulty gyros, or sabotage. They would never suspect that in the air above England, invisible radio waves were turning their vengeance into ashes. Long before the first V-1 was launched, the concept behind the variable time fuse, or VT fuse, had been considered impossible. The idea that a shell could sense its target and detonate itself at precisely the right moment seemed like something from the realm of science fiction. Yet, in 1940, at the height of Britain's desperation, a small group of scientists in the United States began turning that dream into reality. The breakthrough began at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. The team was led by physicist Dr. Merle Tuve, whose earlier work with radar made him uniquely suited for what the military called Project T. The problem was clear. Existing anti-aircraft fuses relied on mechanical timers or contact detonators, both unreliable against fast, high-altitude aircraft. What Tuve's group envisioned was something radically new, a fuse that would know when it was close enough to explode. The solution came from the invisible world of radio waves. The idea was to fit a tiny radar transmitter and receiver inside the tip of an artillery shell. As the shell flew, it would emit a continuous signal. When the signal bounced off a nearby target, an aircraft for example, it would cause a slight frequency change, a beat pattern. The fuse's circuitry could detect this change and instantly trigger the detonator. The shell would effectively detonate itself at the perfect moment, ensuring maximum damage. But designing such a fuse wasn't the hardest part. Building one that could survive the launch was. The shell's acceleration exceeded 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to crush any fragile component. Every tiny vacuum tube, every solder joint had to endure unimaginable stress. Tube's team had to invent not only new circuits, but new materials, new methods of assembly, and even new testing techniques. They eventually developed miniature vacuum tubes, just the size of a thimble, encased in hardened glass and sealed against moisture. Each was carefully hand-built, tested, and packed into the fuse assembly. Inside, the wiring was potted with wax and resin to prevent vibration damage. To prevent corrosion in the field, each fuse was sealed with nitrogen and waterproofed to military standards. By 1942, the first tests were conducted at Dahlgren Proving Ground in Virginia. Firing 5-inch naval shells fitted with experimental VT fuses, the results stunned observers. The shells didn't need direct hits. They exploded close enough to shower targets with lethal fragments. Destroying a drone aircraft that had previously taken hundreds of rounds now took only a handful. It was a revolution hidden inside a few inches of metal. Still, the weapon's true potential had to remain secret. The U.S. Navy classified the VT fuse under the strictest security, limiting knowledge to only a few senior officers. Early production went first to the Pacific Fleet, where anti-aircraft gunners used them to devastating effect against Japanese dive bombers. Reports from the Solomon Islands described entire formations wiped out before reaching their targets. Admiral William Halsey called it the most important anti-aircraft development of the war. The U.S. Army and RAF followed soon after. Yet despite its success at sea, scientists and strategists hesitated to deploy it widely over Europe. The risk of a dud falling into enemy hands was too great. For nearly a year, the proximity fuse remained the most carefully guarded secret after the atomic bomb and radar. That secrecy paid off when the Germans unleashed the V-1 offensive. They had no idea that within weeks, British gun crews would receive crates of these strange sealed shells, each one packed with a miniature brain. When fired, they would do what no human eye or mechanical timer could accomplish: sense their enemy and destroy it in midair. The scientists of APL and their counterparts in the Ordnance Department never stood on the front lines, but their work shifted the balance of war. What had started as a theoretical experiment in electromagnetic waves became a decisive weapon against Hitler's vengeance program. Years later, Dr. Tuve would recall the moment the reports came in from the Channel Coast, gun crews shooting down 80% of incoming V-1s in a single day. He simply smiled and said, "It worked exactly as it should." The VT fuse had made the impossible possible. It had given artillery eyes, ears, and intelligence, and changed forever the way men would fight in the air. The morning of July 16, 1944, broke gray and humid over the English Channel. The guns along the coast had not slept in weeks. From Dover to Beachy Head, hundreds of barrels, 3.7-inch heavies, 40mm Bofors, twin Ehrlichens, stood ready. Their crews were weary but determined. Every night since mid-June, the sky had growled with the unmistakable pulse of Hitler's new weapon, the V-1 flying bomb, the buzz bomb. London had endured weeks of explosions, flames, and rubble. The capital was scarred, its citizens exhausted. But that morning, something was different. Inside the command post of Anti-Aircraft Command's 1st AA Group, new crates had arrived days earlier under armed guard. They contained the most secret weapon Britain had ever received from America, shells fitted with variable-time fuses. Only a handful of officers even knew what they were. To the gunners, they were just special shells. The orders were simple: load them, fire them, and report results to headquarters. No questions, no disassembly. At 0730 hours, the first radar blips appeared, V-1s, incoming from northern France. Controllers shouted coordinates, gun crews snapped to stations. The new shells were distributed among select batteries for trial. The gunners aimed, calculated, and waited for the distant buzzing that always preceded destruction. Then it came, a harsh, insect-like drone building in the distance. "Buzz bomb inbound!" a lookout yelled. Gun number 3 of the 184th Heavy AA battery fired first. The shells arced into the gray sky, leaving trails of smoke. At 7,000 feet, a V-1 streaked past, its pulse jet hammering. Then, suddenly, a perfect flash. The bomb disintegrated midair, raining fragments into the channel. The crews stared in stunned silence. No contact hit, no direct aim, just proximity. More guns opened up. Dozens of shells, each guided by its invisible radio pulse, began detonating near the incoming bombs, each burst precisely timed. One after another, V-1s exploded in the air. Gunners could actually see the air shimmering with impacts. The sky, once helpless against the flying bombs, now fought back with intelligence. By noon, radar controllers reported that 82% of all V-1s entering the defended zone that morning had been destroyed. 85 out of 104 missiles. British officers assumed there was an error in calculation. They double-checked the radar logs and optical sighting reports, but the figures held. 82%. Word spread quietly through the batteries that something extraordinary had happened. We didn't just improve our shooting, we'd become something different. Something that could think faster than the bombs. Londoners, though they didn't know the reason, felt the difference almost immediately. The familiar droning in the night lessened, explosions in the streets grew fewer. In the shelters, people whispered that perhaps the Germans had run out of bombs. They hadn't. The V-1s were still coming, but now they were being torn from the sky. The following day, British newspapers cautiously celebrated new and remarkable improvements in anti-aircraft defense. No details were given. The VT fuse remained one of the most carefully guarded secrets after the atomic bomb and radar. Allies' most guarded secrets. Only a select few in Whitehall and Washington knew that a few inches of circuitry had changed the course of the war. Across the Channel, German intelligence officers were baffled. Their reports from Pas-de-Calais showed normal V-1 launches, normal trajectories, yet the missiles simply failed to reach London in any significant numbers. Engineers were ordered to check guidance gyros, fuel mixes, and flight timers. None found any faults. Luftwaffe analysts speculated about a new Allied radar jamming system, but the truth was something far simpler and infinitely more advanced. In the following weeks, as the proximity-fused shells were distributed to more batteries, the success continued. Kill ratios stayed above 75%, an unprecedented figure in anti-aircraft warfare. Pilots flying over the channel could see the results themselves, V-1s detonating mid-air like strings of firecrackers. The British gunners had found their rhythm, the pulse of defense matching the enemy's mechanical heartbeat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On that July day, the balance of terror had shifted. The VT fuse had turned the night sky from a hunting ground into a fortress. What had once been fear became precision. What had once been guesswork became science. For the people of London, July 16, 1944 would be remembered as the day the buzzing finally began to fade. For the scientists and soldiers who made it possible, it was proof that invention, secrecy, and courage could defeat vengeance itself. The Germans never learned how it was done. They never knew that invisible waves, measured in microseconds, had saved a city. The success of July 16th reverberated through the highest levels of Allied command, but almost no one outside a handful of scientists and senior officers ever knew why. To the world, the sudden improvement in anti-aircraft efficiency was attributed to better radar, improved fire control, or simply increased experience. The truth, the VT fuse, remained buried beneath layers of classification thicker than the armor on a battleship. In Whitehall, a secret communiqué was sent from General Sir Frederick Pyle, head of Britain's anti-aircraft command, to the U.S. War Department. Performance of new ammunition exceeds all prior expectations. Recommend continued supply under strictest security. Disclosure would compromise a critical advantage. At the U.S. War Office, the message landed on the desk of General George C. Marshall, who immediately ordered a continuation of shipments, but with one caveat. Not a single unexploded shell was to land on enemy soil. Any dud must be recovered or destroyed at once. The fear was simple. If the Germans captured one intact, they could unravel its secrets within months. To ensure that never happened, crews were trained to sweep beaches and impact zones for unexploded rounds. Naval patrols off Dover retrieved fragments from the sea, confirming none had drifted ashore in France. Every recovered fuse was returned to laboratories for destruction. The secret was safe. The British gunners themselves were only told fragments of the truth. Most believed the shells contained magnetic sensors or acoustic timers. They didn't care much what was inside. They only knew it worked. Whatever they put in those things, one gunner later said, it made the bombs die like flies. As July turned to August, the German V-1 campaign began to falter. Launch sites were bombed daily by the RAF and U.S. 8th Air Force. Each day, fewer missiles crossed the channel, and those that did rarely made it past the defensive belts. The skies over southern England, once filled with the maddening drone of pulse jets, now echoed mostly with the steady thump of anti-aircraft fire, and silence afterward. Yet the Germans still had no idea what had changed. Captured Luftwaffe officers speculated wildly. Some claimed the British had developed electronic fogs or new high-velocity shells. Others believed sabotage was at work, or that the bomb's guidance gyros were being jammed by Allied radio signals. In truth, the cause was invisible. Microscopic tubes inside fuses that the Germans never knew existed. The secrecy was so intense that even Allied pilots were kept in the dark. Fighter command squadrons patrolling the coast were simply told to coordinate with improved ground defenses. The pilots soon noticed how many V-1s were being destroyed before they could engage. It was like the gunners had suddenly become sharpshooters overnight, recalled a Tempest pilot from No. 3 Squadron RAF. Meanwhile, in Washington, Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at the Applied Physics Laboratory received the reports with quiet satisfaction. They couldn't celebrate publicly, but the data told the story. Kill ratios climbing above 80%, ammunition efficiency tripled, civilian casualties drastically reduced. The device that had once been called theoretical folly was now a cornerstone of victory. The U.S. Ordnance Department's final field note that month read simply,
Proximity fuse performance, beyond expectation. Recommended for full-scale field deployment. Still, even in triumph, caution reigned. The VT fuse was not to be used in land warfare, not yet. Army Chief of Staff Marshall and Secretary of War Henry Stimson both feared that a ground-fired shell might misfire and leave a sample for German recovery. It was only in December 1944, during the desperate days of the Battle of the Bulge, that the restriction would finally be lifted. But that was months ahead. In the summer of 1944, secrecy remained absolute. For Britain, the impact was immediate and measurable. Civil defense records showed that after July 16th, daily V-1 impacts on London dropped by 75%. The number of civilian casualties fell
just as sharply. The barrage balloons, radar screens, and coastal batteries working in concert had finally built an invisible shield. London was battered, but it had survived the storm. When the campaign ended that September, the statistics spoke for themselves. Of the over 9,500 V-1s launched toward Britain, nearly half were destroyed in flight, and a vast majority of those by guns using the VT fuse. The exact figures, never revealed publicly during the war, show that 82% of all confirmed shootdowns on the best days were due to proximity-fused shells. Yet the Germans never learned why. Not in 1944, not in 1945, not even after the war's end when Allied investigators combed through captured records. Nowhere in the archives of the Luftwaffe or the V-weapons division was there any mention of radio-detonating shells. They had simply never imagined it. In one of his final reports, General Pyle wrote, "The secret of our defense remains unguessed by the enemy. It is perhaps the finest example of science serving humanity in the face of terror." The day the buzzing stopped had been a triumph not of firepower alone, but of intellect, discipline, and silence. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, Europe was left in ruins. But within that silence lay another absence, one that even the victors refused to speak of. Among the destroyed laboratories of Peenemünde, the abandoned bunkers at Watten and V-1s, and the captured records of the Luftwaffe's Führungsstab, the Allies discovered reams of data on the V-weapons program, production charts, range tests, launch logs. But no mention of why the V-1 offensive had failed so disastrously. The Germans had theories. They blamed the weather, poor fuel quality, or sabotage by forced laborers. They even accused their own scientists of miscalibrating the guidance gyroscopes. But the true reason, the invisible radio pulse of the VT fuse, was beyond their imagination. They had seen shells bursting near their missiles on radar, but they interpreted it as luck, not precision. In their technical post-mortem reports, German engineers wrote that Allied gunners appear to improve timing devices or automatic predictors. The truth was far beyond improvement. It was a revolution. At the Nuremberg interrogations in 1946, former officers of the German 4th Air Group, responsible for the V-1 campaign, were questioned by Allied intelligence. One of them, Major Karl Brandt, still refused to believe what he was told, that radio fuses, each small enough to fit into a 90mm shell, had detected and destroyed their weapons mid-flight. "Impossible," he said flatly. "No tube could survive that acceleration." The American interrogator only smiled and showed him a shattered fragment of glass from a recovered VT fuse. Brandt stared at it in silence. "Then," he murmured, "we were fighting ghosts." The ghost analogy was apt. The VT fuse had never announced itself. Its power lay in invisibility, in silence, secrecy, and science. Even as Allied artillerymen celebrated its success, few understood the details. And after the war, the Allies deliberately maintained that mystery. The official British after-action summaries of Operation Diver, declassified only decades later, replaced the words proximity fuse with improved AA shell. The American reports in 1945's U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey European Theater never once referenced radio detonation, though the data clearly reflected its use. The secret stayed locked inside defense archives, classified as critical wartime technology. It would remain restricted well into the 1950s. Meanwhile, in the ruined cities of Germany, the myth of the V-1 persisted. Civilians remembered its buzzing drone, the panic it caused, and then, mysteriously, how it seemed to stop one day. For years, the story passed through whispers. The English built a new radar wall, they had invisible guns, or God himself stopped the bombs. In truth, it was neither a radar wall nor a divine act. It was a handful of American scientists working out of small laboratories in Maryland and New Jersey, men who never saw the battlefield but changed it forever. When those scientists were later honored by Congress in 1947, Dr. Merle Tuve refused personal recognition. He said, "We were not heroes. The gunners were. We just gave them eyes." And those eyes reshaped every branch of warfare. The same principles of the VT fuse would become the foundation for modern air defense systems, missile guidance, and eventually space tracking technology. From the radar-controlled guns of Korea to the proximity detonation of modern interceptors, the ghost of the VT fuse lived on. But for all its importance, its greatest triumph remained its quietest, the fact that its secret never fell into enemy hands. The Germans never captured one. The Japanese, who faced it in the Pacific, never understood it. Even the Soviets, though they obtained post-war samples, never replicated it successfully until years later. In one sense, the VT fuse was a weapon of intelligence, not of destruction. It measured victory not in bodies or craters, but in silence. The silence that fell over London when the V-1 stopped falling. The silence that settled over Germany when their engineers realized they had been beaten by an idea they couldn't even conceive. By the time the Allies publicly acknowledged its existence, the world had already moved on to atomic headlines. The proximity fuse was never celebrated in the same way as the bomb or the jet engine. Yet for those who understood its true significance, it remained the unsung miracle of 1944. When the post-war symposium on military science convened in 1962, one aging RAF officer was asked what had really saved London from the V-1 terror. He paused, smiled faintly, and said, "It wasn't the guns, and it wasn't luck. It was something you couldn't see, and neither could the Germans." That was the legacy of the VT fuse, unseen, unspoken, but unmistakably victorious. When the war ended in 1945, most of the world celebrated the atomic bomb as the defining technological triumph of the conflict. Newspapers filled front pages with the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, calling it the weapon that ended the war. Yet deep within the archives of the U.S. Navy, the Army Ordnance Department, and the British Ministry of Supply, another secret remained sealed, a weapon that had already proven its quiet, invisible power long before the atomic age began. That secret was the variable time fuse, known simply by two letters that would remain classified for decades: VT. For the gunners who had fought the V-1 Blitz in the summer of 1944, it was the weapon that made the difference between terror and survival. For the scientists who built it, it was proof that science, precision, and perseverance could protect civilization itself. But for the Germans, who never discovered what had truly destroyed their flying bombs, it became a riddle they would never solve. The proximity fuse began as a desperate gamble in 1940, when the U.S. Navy sought a way to increase anti-aircraft accuracy. Before VT, gunners had to rely on timed or impact fuses, both nearly useless against fast, evasive aircraft. Hitting a target required mathematics, luck, and divine patience. Only about one shell in 200 found its mark. But in a small laboratory at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, a team led by physicist Dr. Merle Tuve proposed something radical: a miniature radio transmitter built inside the fuse of a shell. When the signal reflected off a nearby aircraft, it would automatically detonate the explosive at the precise moment of closest approach.
The challenge seemed impossible. The electronics would need to survive being fired from a gun, a force of more than 20,000 Gs, and still function perfectly in midair. By 1942, after thousands of failures and near-mythic persistence, they succeeded. The first proximity fuses were tested at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, with astonishing results. The shells exploded with uncanny precision, close enough to destroy aircraft without ever scoring a direct hit. Admiral Lewis Strauss later said, "The proximity fuse, next to the atomic bomb, was the most important new development in World War II." But secrecy was absolute. Each fuse cost more than a week's wages to make, and every unit was guarded like nuclear material. The British and Americans knew that if even one unexploded shell fell into enemy hands, the Axis powers could reverse engineer it. For the first 3 years, VT fuses were used only over water against Japanese planes, where no fragments could be recovered. When the first V-1 flying bombs began falling on London in June 1944, panic threatened to undo months of Allied confidence. The pulse jet engines of the V-1 droned overhead like a mechanical plague. 400 miles per hour of steel, explosives, and terror. More than 9,000 Londoners were killed, tens of thousands injured. Traditional anti-aircraft shells and barrage balloons did little to stop them. Then, on July 16, 1944, under the code name Operation Diver, the U.S. Army and RAF introduced a new defense along the southern English coast. The 90mm M1 guns of the American AA Command, secretly equipped with VT fuses, opened fire against incoming V-1s. The results stunned even the Allies themselves. Within 24 hours, radar tracking confirmed that 82% of all V-1s launched that day had been destroyed before reaching their targets, the highest single-day success rate of the war. Gun crews described the air filled with instant flowers of fire as shells detonated automatically near the speeding bombs. Londoners who had endured weeks of terror suddenly realized the sky had gone quiet. The buzzing stopped. The Germans never understood why. When Allied troops captured Peenemünde in 1945, they expected to find evidence that the Germans had discovered the VT fuse. They found nothing. German scientists had never even theorized such a device. Their records blamed increased Allied coordination, improved predictors, or bad atmospheric conditions. They never grasped that they had been defeated by an unseen radio wave. In a post-war debriefing, one German engineer remarked, "Our V-1 was perfect, yet it fell from the sky as if cursed." The curse was science and silence. The Allies had kept the fuse so secret that even American artillerymen who used it were told only that it was an improved timing device. Few understood they were handling one of the most advanced electronic systems of the war. For years after 1945, the proximity fuse remained classified. When its existence was finally made public in 1948, it received modest recognition, overshadowed by the atomic bomb and the jet engine. Yet, in terms of lives saved, historians estimate the VT fuse shortened the war by at least 6 months and saved tens of thousands of Allied soldiers and civilians.
In 1965, a generation after its debut, a U.S. Army officer writing for Military Review called it the invisible shield, the first real marriage of electronics and firepower. And still, the Germans never truly knew. Post-war technical journals in West Germany discussed mysterious Allied radar-controlled shells, but their details were speculation. No captured samples, no recovered fragments, no data, nothing. The Allies had erased the trail completely. In 1985, at a veterans reunion in Norfolk, Virginia, an elderly Luftwaffe officer met a former U.S. gun commander from the 184th AAA Battalion, one of the first to fire VT-fused shells during Operation Diver. The two men shook hands. The German asked quietly, "Tell me, was it radar?" The American smiled. Something like that. He didn't elaborate. Some secrets, even after 40 years, didn't need words. By the end of 1944, the V-1 campaign had failed. What the Germans had believed would break British morale instead demonstrated the triumph of Allied science and cooperation. In the months that followed, the Allies moved on to new challenges: the Ardennes, the Rhine, the Pacific. But the victory over the V-1s remained unique. A battle won not by more men or more guns, but by a few inches of glass and wire hidden inside a shell. Historians often call the proximity fuse the second secret weapon. It was not a device of destruction, but of defense, a miracle that saved lives by ensuring accuracy. It never bore a famous name. No single man claimed it, and no grand monument marks its place. Yet every modern missile defense system, every radar-guided interceptor, and every automated weapon owes its existence to that small glass heart that pulsed once in the skies over London. In the end, it wasn't vengeance or terror that defined the air war over Europe. It was the silent brilliance of a few scientists and the gunners who trusted them. On July 16, 1944, as the sky cleared and the last V-1 fell, one British officer looked up and whispered, "The buzzing has stopped." It was not just the end of a weapon, it was the sound of science defeating fear. The Germans never knew why, but history does, and it remembers.